And now we're ready to go. Okay, so move this sucker. All right. So this is where we left off on Wednesday. And I'm glad I'm covering this material before Dory Weaver comes, because if she ever asks me something about, hey, a drug, you might know it because I probably covered it yet. But this is the kind of stuff that you need to know, believe it or not, for pharmacology. Certainly when we talk about the drugs and how they work. How do you know how a drug works? Unless you know how the normal physiological system works. And then when it's not working anymore, the body's not able to keep those things within normal ranges. That's where nursing and healthcare comes in. And that's where pharmacological treatments come in. It's to fix that problem. All right, so this is very relevant. So we had covered all this vocab. And then I had this GIF, which we'd seen before. It's very slow. I don't have my laser pointer up yet, but this is review. The action potential, turn it on. The action potential came down the neuron to the synaptic knob, and then that caused the release of vesicles containing a neurotransmitter, in this case, acetylcholine. It's a very common one, a very important one in nursing. And the acetylcholine neurotransmitter binds to this ion channel right here. And it's a channel that when it binds, it opens up the channel. And then sodium, which is out, this is the cell, sodium outside the cell comes flooding in. And we know that sodium is always stimulatory. So this cell is going to be stimulated. It forms an action potential. If it's a skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, it's going to contract. If it's a gland, it's going to secrete something. Okay. And I spent a little time talking, not writing anything down, that once that cell's been stimulated, it needs to rest after. Okay. Because when it's stimulated, its membrane goes to a positive 30. And then when it rests, it has to go back down to minus 70. And I talked about the ions that are important in that. All right. Sodium, potassium pump and all that. But I gave you a more practical aspect of this. And acetylcholine is a good example. All your skeletal muscles work by acetylcholine signaling. And then sodium comes in and it stimulates your skeletal muscles to contract. If you don't get that neurotransmitter out of the synapse and allow skeletal muscles to contract, they keep contracting and now you've got seizures and now your body temperature skyrockets and that's very potentially lethal, okay? Acetylcholine runs your entire digestive system, turns it on, activates it under rest and digest or parasympathetic control. If there's too much acetylcholine in the synapse and it's not removed, your GI tract is going to be on hyperdrive. You're going to have the runs. You might urinate. Your bladder is smooth muscle stimulated by acetylcholine. You will have an upset stomach because your entire GI tract, the peristalsis is going crazy. You'll salivate because your parotid, all your glands are going to be stimulated by acetylcholine. And I gave you a situation where I saw that as a veterinary nurse. Animal came in with all these symptoms of acetylcholine poisoning, basically, because they were exposed to a flea and tick med that disabled an enzyme that's supposed to break down acetylcholine and get it out of the synapse so all those cells could rest. All right. So could that happen to humans? Sure. Because a lot of pesticides used in agriculture are organophosphate pesticides. And if a farmer's out there loading his tractor boom, the spraying boom with the concentrate and diluting it with water, and he spills any of that on him, it's going to absorb across his skin and he's going to be rushed to the hospital, hopefully, with the same symptoms that I saw in the dog. Okay. So yes, it could happen. So it's relevant to nursing. Okay, so we covered a lot on Wednesday. We're going to continue on. So more review of neurotransmitter signaling, because I've already talked about it, but do remember that when you're looking at the wiki textbook, you don't have to open up and scroll. Just type in 57 in the pages up ahead, and it'll bring you right to my comment box. Let me move this. That's very distracting. Okay, so sodium and calcium are always stimulatory. If a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor on a cell and it opens up a sodium channel or a calcium channel, that is going to be stimulatory. So the cell forms an action potential. These words are all synonyms. Or it gets depolarized, or it's just stimulated. All right, those mean all the same thing. Oh, it's not working. Okay. if a potassium or a chloride ion channel are opened, and I don't know why this won't go away. There we go. If those are open, it's going to be inhibited. The cell's going to repolarize or rest. So I'd like to put the R's together. Repolarize means rest. So at this point, you don't know, well, you might, I don't mean to deprecate or patronize you. You might know some stuff about neurotransmitters, but I'm kind of guessing maybe not a lot. But I'm going to have a little built-in test here. You don't even know the neurotransmitters binding to the cell, but based on what ion channel is open, you'll now be able to tell me what that cell does. Is it stimulated or is it inhibited? Because those are going to be important. Okay, so neurotransmitter signaling. I don't know why my slide advance is not working, but the neuron that's communicating with a cell could be another neuron, could be a muscle cell, could be a gland. So for example, if it releases acetylcholine into the synapse, binds to the receptor, okay, then it'll open up an ion channel. In this case, I'm saying sodium. Then sodium, since it's always high outside the cell, it wants to go by simple diffusion from high to low. It'll go into the cell because sodium's low in the cell. And that happens very quickly and it's passive. Then the cell is stimulated and whatever it's designed to do, contract or secrete something, it does. And so I think I mentioned right here, if you're online while you're looking at this PDF, it's a YouTube video. It's actually really good. It goes through this again so you can see it because these GIFs, when you're on the PowerPoint, aren't active. It'll show you how it can either stimulate a cell or inhibit it based on the ion channels that are open. I think this video even talks about some of the removal systems that I'm going to be covering a little bit later, maybe not today. All right. But so I add a lot of stuff so that if you want to look at something, looking at PowerPoint slides is okay. But we have this whole wonderful world of YouTube where you can actually type something in and see it. And that's what I've done. And I've made the links so that you can go right to it. Because sometimes looking at a video can explain it to you much better than me waving my hands all up here, right? I mean, I hope I do an okay job, but sometimes YouTube does it better. Okay, so repeat of the ions. In general, if it opens up sodium or calcium, here's how I remember these. Sodium, all right, Na, is always stimulatory. S goes with the S. Calcium makes cells crazy. They're stimulated. The opposite, if it's potassium or chloride ion channels, potassium, which is a letter K, helps cells kick back and relax. It inhibits them. Remember how I talked about too much potassium in the blood makes your heart rate go down dangerously? Okay, and it's used in the lethal injection. So it definitely inhibits your heart cells. Chloride with the C helps cells stay calm. All right, so if you remember that, you'll never go wrong with those. And then, of course, this takes you to the same YouTube video I had before, but I did one of those where you put the link or at that current time in the video, so you don't have to sit through the whole video to see how cells are being stimulated or inhibited. It jumps ahead to just that part. Okay. All right, now we're getting to the nitty-gritty. It's not bad, it really isn't. Vocabulary. It's just kind of too complicated, but if a cell is being stimulated, it's being excited. So it's called an excitatory post-synaptic potential, or EPSP. It's post-synaptic because it's the cell after the synapse with the neuron that's communicating with it. It's after that synapse. And it's being excited, EPSP. So if sodium or calcium channels are open, the cell that's responding is going to have an EPSP. Now, how that cell responds to that stimulation, there's a couple more vocabulary terms to describe how a cell is being stimulated. And that, in EPSP, can produce a graded potential. Now, here's where I check to see if my pen is working for me today. A graded potential is, come on, pen. Here we go. More neurotransmitter in the synapse. Oops. Synapse equals more cell response. And the opposite is true. Less in synapse equals less response. So that's graded. Here's the analogy to that. You're being graded in this course. Soon, I'm going to be grading a quiz, but overall, you get graded. The more effort you put into your performance in the course, the better grade you get. The less effort you put into the course and studying for it, the lower the grade you get. It's the same thing with neurotransmitters. It's graded. So you got a lot of neurotransmitter in synapse, you get a lot of cell response. Very little neurotransmitter in the synapse, less responsive. Here's a good example, and I'm not going to write it down, but you can write it down. Think about oxytocin. Talked about it in chapter 1. Positive feedback. If a woman is breastfeeding her child, it stimulates the touch receptors on the nipple. The hypothalamus releases a little bit of oxytocin, which goes down to the bloodstream, to the mammary glands, and causes them to release the milk into the duct. It's a milk release hormone. And that oxytocin causes the milk release. But since it's only a little bit of oxytocin can make your uterus contract too. But it's not releasing a lot of oxytocin in that particular scenario. The uterus will contract, but not anywhere near the amount that happens during childbirth. If anyone of you has ever nursed a child, you probably realize you get some minor uterine contractions. It's one of the benefits of breastfeeding, because after pregnancy and birth, that breastfeeding causes the uterine to get more toned back, because every time you nurse, a little bit of oxytocin causes some uterine contractions, but they're not painful. Childbirth, baby's head pressing on the cervix, hypothalamus releases a huge amount of oxytocin, causes the uterine muscles to have huge contractions. That's a graded response. Little oxytocin, little bit of contraction. Lots of oxytocin, huge amount of contraction. That's a graded potential. All right. Now, the other thing that can happen is called summation, and it has to do with how frequently the neurotransmitter binds to the synapse. Checking my time here. So, higher stimulation frequency with the neurotrans, and I'll just use the little W with the slash means with the neurotransmitter equals greater cell response. And then lower stimulation frequency equals less response. Right. Now, this one's a little hard to explain, but I'll do it this way. Let's say you've got some neurotransmitter in the synapse that could bind with a receptor on the cell. If that neurotransmitter only binds infrequently, like stimulation, that's very infrequent. The cell response is going to be much less because it's not being stimulated very frequently. But if the cell is being stimulated like this, very fast, very frequent, it's going to respond more strongly. Okay, your skeletal muscles work that way. Okay, and I think I have some sort of example here. Okay, the example of an excitatory post-synaptic potential, the example of EPSP, just the general example. So your heart rate, when it goes up, let's say your blood pressure was too low, right? Go back to chapter 1, we just took a quiz on. Baroreceptors detect it, send a signal to the medulla. The medulla responds by stimulating some muscles. It stimulates your heart rate to go up, and that will increase your blood pressure. So I'm adding something here. So where's this? Okay. Epinephrine, which is your fight-flight hormone, also known as adrenaline, it binds to a specific receptor on heart muscles. The name of that receptor, and I'll get to it much later, and you'll learn it, is called a beta-1, oops, misspelling. Cut out the N. Adrenergic, there's no N. That's a typo, I have to fix that. a beta-1 adrenergic receptor. When epinephrine binds to the beta-1 adrenergic receptor on the heart, it opens up sodium and calcium channels, both of them. And you know those ion channels will stimulate the heart and produces EPSPs. So I've taken what you know happens during stimulation of the medulla to increase heart rate. This is what's happening to make the heart rate go up. It involves a neurotransmitter or slash hormone in this case, and a receptor that opens up ion channels. You know about heart rate going up when you need your blood pressure up. I explained to you about the ion channels. Now I'm telling you, this is the particular neurotransmitter and this is the particular receptor. So I'm going to build upon pre-existing knowledge. But this is what the nursing program wants. Let me give you a for example of how important this is. What's the big three in the PD? Diabetes, cardiovascular problems, and hypertension. This pathway, that receptor, that neurotransmitter, those ion channels. So you're going to be seeing people who have chronic hypertension, and you have to treat that because long-term it causes a whole bunch of other problems, like increase your risk for stroke and things like that. So they can try diet, exercise, and if that doesn't work, or they've got an inherited component to it, there's a genetic predisposition, and they do all those things and they still have high blood pressure, now you're talking about pharmacological drugs. There's all different ways to treat high blood pressure. Before, when I was talking about these ion channels, I said, if someone has high blood pressure, you can treat them with drugs that are called sodium or calcium channel blockers. And so even if epinephrine's in the bloodstream, you're blocking these channels so that they don't open up as much. And so the heart rate stays lower. And if heart rate stays lower, blood pressure stays lower. That's one way of approaching it. What happens if your patient doesn't respond to those particular drugs? Because we're all different physiologically, and not everyone's going to respond to the same drug the same way. So that's why we have so many different ways to treat it. Has anyone ever heard of beta blockers? That's a very commonly prescribed drug. I've had students in previous courses that were on beta blockers because they had a problem. Beta blockers block this receptor. So epinephrine can't bind. So it can't open up those channels because the receptor can't bind. And it keeps the heart rate low and it keeps the blood pressure low. Now you know how beta blockers work because of that receptor, right? Everyday nursing, beta blockers. That's how they work. All right, keeping check of the time, we're okay. Now, you can also inhibit a cell if you open up the potassium or chloride ion channels. It prevents the action potential from forming. The cell stays resting. An example of this IPSP, okay? So IPSP example is, that's a terrible P, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine rules all of your rest and digest functions. When your body's at rest, parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, acetylcholine controls all of those things that happen in your body when you're at rest. So your heart, when you're at rest, your heart rate is low because your body doesn't see it being in a fight and flight situation. So it's resting. So what happens during this system is acetylcholine, ACH is the abbreviation, binds to a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Now look at the word acetylcholine. It's got the word choline in it. Its receptor has got the word choline in it too. That's why it's called a cholinergic receptor. I'll get to the muscarinic next. Let me back up for a sec. Notice epinephrine, I'll put this down, is called adrenaline. Has got the word adren in its receptor name. That's why the receptor is called that. It's a receptor that binds to adrenaline. So the receptor, what its name is, tells you what neurotransmitter it's binding to. So if we go back to this one, cholinergic receptor is for acetylcholine because it's got the word in it. So when that neurotransmitter binds to that receptor on your heart, your pacemaker, it opens up potassium channels. And that makes the heart rate go down. It's resting. All right, it's not stopped, but the heart rate is lower. Does that make sense? Because I'm throwing out the real physiology at you now. We're just building up to this point, right? I know you just had a quiz and you're like, oh, my brain hurts. Try and hold on a little bit longer because this is important. All right. regulation. I'm going to introduce you to 2 neurotransmitter types, and that's where we'll end it. But you need to know these for nursing. All right. So a nicotinic receptor. Okay. It's also known as ion gated, but it's a nicotinic receptor. I don't know what they're going to teach it to you in nursing, but I think it's nicotinic. It's for acetylcholine it's for acetylcholine neurotransmitter. To make skeletal muscles contract. Now there's other nicotinic receptors in your body, but I'm not getting into it. It's just too complicated and it's too much and you don't need to know that much. But you need to know how your skeletal muscles work because there's going to be skeletal muscle disorders you're going to encounter in nursing. I think I have a cigarette there. Cigarette has a wonderful addictive chemical called nicotine. Okay. In order to smoke a cigarette or a vape, you have to use voluntary muscles to pick it up, put it to your lips to smoke it, right? That's voluntary skeletal muscle activity. That's skeletal muscles. So when you think of the receptor on skeletal muscles for acetylcholine, it's called a cholinergic receptor, okay? Okay, receptor equals a nicotinic cholinergic. It's called a cholinergic receptor because it binds to acetylcholine, ACH, and the particular cholinergic receptor on skeletal muscles is nicotinic. So if you remember, you have to voluntarily use your skeletal muscle to pick up a cigarette. Cigarette contains nicotine. It's a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. Is it silly? Sure. But you'll remember it one day when I have an exam on this. You're like, is it a muscarinic cholinergic or is it a nicotinic? Oh, wait, there's nicotine in a cigarette and you have to pick it up voluntarily. And the receptor is a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. You'll remember that. You'll always remember that. Trust me. I have students contacting me saying, it's been years since I've taken your course, but I still remember the difference between nicotinic and cholinergic receptors because of these little associations. Okay, now a muscarinic receptor, musk or mus. Think of this, think you must do it. You have no choice. It is autonomic. Okay, so it is a receptor for I lost my pen. Autonomic body responses. It is not voluntary. It's on autopilot. It's body functions that are so important that you have no control over them. Remember when I said you can't, if you have a uterus, go ahead and make it contract and go. You don't have voluntary control of that. Oxytocin is going to bind to a receptor it's autonomic. Same thing with salivary secretions. You can't make them happen. All right. So what do I have here? Okay. And I said, this is where I'll stop and this is where I'll stop. So just remember nicotinic receptors, think skeletal muscles, muscarinic receptors are things you have no control over. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.